Hello everyone. In this video we'll be learning about the controllers. So before we proceed further, let us understand what is a logic controller. Logic controller is nothing but a plugin in the Apache JMeter that club all the underlying requests together, and also it determines the order in which the samplers are processed. That means that the underlying request that is clubbed under that particular controller executes. We'll be learning more about in the video. Let us see one by one. So the first one is a simple controller. What happens in a simpler controller? Or you can see there are three requests. All these three requests are clubbed under the same. We can't keep these requests independently in a thread group. It has to be under a particular shed. So simple controller executes much like that. It doesn't have a function as such, but it will help you to keep the underlying request in a maintained way. Let us execute the request underneath, and you'll see the three requests got executed one by one. 1, 2, 3. Now what happens if we want a response that is addition of all these three requests and not individual ones? So in that case we'll be using transaction controller. I have put transaction controller under this, and let's comment this. And in transaction controller you can see there are two check box options. One is the generate parent sample. If you check this, it will only give one output response, and that has all the three request response clubbed together into a single form. And this request and this particular check function which allow you to include your post and pre-processors together. We'll be learning more about the post and pre-processor in this course, but for now let us see what happens if we don't uncheck them. I'll not uncheck them, and you can see these three requests got executed along with one transaction controller. Now I'll check this and see what happens. See, only we are getting one response, and underneath there are three requests. So what we learned, that in transaction controller three requests can be clubbed together into a single form to get one single response. The third is the if controller. Like in any programming language, if controller allows you to execute its underlying samplers only when a certain condition is met. In this case I have written it's Google. Let's change it and click it on 1. And I've used a regular expression extractor. We'll be learning this later in the course. Let us see how this functions. So the first, this particular sampler got executed, but not the if controller. Why? Because the condition is not met. Now I'll undo it and clear this, and I will execute it. Yeah, you can see the if controller got executed underneath. Now let us see what happens for a loop controller. Loop controller will execute your underlying samplers the number of times you have mentioned here. So I have mentioned here 5, so this is supposed to get executed 5 times. Let us see. I'll click on 5. 1, 3, 4, 5. So this is the function of a loop controller. While controller, like in any programming language, if controller gets executed only when or only after a condition is met, but in the case of a while controller, the execution happens after that the condition is checked. I have written a counter over here, and I see it will execute only less than twice number of times. And let us see how this gets executed. It will get executed only twice. Now I'll change it to suppose 5, and it will execute 5 times. So this is the function of a while loop. It is mainly used to see when a condition is dynamic, but when condition is not coming before the execution of a sampler but with the execution of a sampler. In that case, while loop is very effective. Now the third is a critical section controller. Critical section controller will only allow you to execute a particular script once at a particular time. That means when you are running a thread in a concurrency and same number of requests are clubbed together running one by one, in order to avoid the deadlock, this particular critical section controller will execute this request once at a time under this lock name. This lock name can be changed, but the main function is to execute this particular sampler only once at a time and not in a concurrent way. The next is a random controller. If you can see, it is going to execute these requests randomly at every iteration. Let's change it to 3. Now let's run it. 213, again we'll run it. 113, again we'll run it. 221. Same for the random order controller, same function. See. Okay. Got it? So random controller and random order controller are pretty much same, but what happens in the case of a random controller, the sampler request gets executed I suppose thrice, like once at a time, once the thread is got executed. But in the case of a random order controller, all the 3 requests will get executed 3, like the number of times you are executing. Let us understand this in a more easy way. I'll click on 1 and let us see the random order controller. See, the 3 requests got executed another time, but if I run a random controller, it will run only once. This is the basic difference between random controller and a random order controller. The next controller is a runtime controller. Runtime controller will allow you to run the underlying samplers for a particular period of time. For example, I have mentioned it here 1 second, and let us see how many samplers it gets executed in 1 second. You can see 3 in a sequential manner. Now I'll club it as 5 and I will run it. You can mention the number of seconds here. You can see until 5 seconds lapsed, all the 3 requests will keep on executing again and again and again. This is the basic function of a runtime controller. Next controller is a switch controller. You can see A, B, C. Likewise in programming language, 0 comes for the first order, 1 comes for the second order, and 2 comes for the third order. I will switch the value to 0 and I will see which sampler gets executed. The first. Now I'll make it as 1. I'll click it, second, and I'll go as 2, and I'll make this as third. What will happen if I give suppose 4? Doesn't happen. Switch A. So anything beyond it will go to again 4 because it goes into a loop. What happens if I click on 3? Again the first. So that means it doesn't have anything beyond 2. So it will execute the first one. The next is the recording controller. Recording controller will help you to record your script when we will be doing this in a separate web browser. We'll be doing it later in the course. And this recording controller comes by default. It helps you to club all the requests together. Then with the help of other controllers, we are going to write this one by one. The next is the module controller. Let us see what happens in the case of a module controller. I have in this module controller I have selected this particular transaction and I'll write on execution. Let us use a simple controller in this case. Okay, now I'll put it over here and I'll delete it. Now I'll put a simple controller. Now let us see. You see it got executed twice because once for this and once for this. Now I'll comment it and it should execute once at a time. So that means module controller will allow you to execute any portion of your current script. It do not allow you to execute a separate JMX file. It will only allow you to run a portion of your script that is present, that is in your current window. This is module controller. Now what happens if I use a include controller? Include controller will allow you to execute a separate JMX file into your current JMX file. I have a separate http request.jmx and I am using an include controller to include this into the script, and let us see if this gets executed or not. Yes, it gets executed. This is the function of an include controller. So the basic difference between module controller and include controller is that include controller will allow you to execute a separate JMX file that is present in a different directory, while module controller will only allow you to execute a particular module of your script in your that is present in your current one, in your current window. The next is the only once controller. Only once controller will execute your underlying request only once at a time. To explain it in a better way, I have used a loop controller that is 5 times and once only controller. So technically, since it is under the loop controller, it should execute 5 times. But since we are using only once controller, this Java request will be executed only once. Let's see if it's yes. Now if I put this here separately and I will mark it as once controller, you can see this request got executed 5 times, but only once controller sampler got executed only once. This is the functionality of only once controller. Now the next is Interleave Controller. What happens in the case of Interleave Controller is that it will execute its underlying request alternatively with the one outside the controller. Let us see with an example. So what happens? The first request got executed, then the one outside it, then the second request got executed, then the one outside it, and again the third request got executed, then the one outside it. So alternatively it is going to execute its underlying request with the ones present outside the controller. This is the one. And the third and the last one is Throughput Controller. So what happens in the case of a Throughput Controller is that many a times we have to distribute the number of requests among the controllers. In that case, Throughput Controller plays a very important role. Let us see. I have mentioned the number of threads as 10 and I have kept here a Throughput Controller and I have run total executions as 4. That means although 10 number of times this thread is going to execute, but this request will execute only 4 times. Let us see how this works. We'll be using a summary report and I'll click on play. See, the main request got executed 10 times while the underlying test cases executed 4 number of times. So it has 2 ways, either the total number of executions or we can mention it in the percentage. Now in the percentage I'll mark it as 50%. So 50% of 10 becomes 5. So naturally this will execute only 5 times. Let us see 10 and it becomes 5. Now how to include or how to write a controller? We have to go to the thread, right click, add logic controller list, and you will find the list of all the controllers that we are mentioned. Please remember, it is not as important to understand the samplers than to understand the controllers. Controllers orders the execution pattern of its underlying request, which in turn helps you to write a more robust and a user-friendly script. We'll be learning more about the samplers in the next video. Thank you everyone.